So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Advocacy Cafe. We have Adrien Lawyer joining us here from the Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico. We'll get started here in just a minute. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can go ahead and chat them in the chat box. We will be able to share the slides after the presentation is over. We'll send them out as a PDF. So after the hour-long presentation is over, you will have a chance at noon to ask questions. We'll go ahead and unmute everybody, and you can, just go ahead and talk or discuss or ask questions. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, just go ahead and chat them in the chat box. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Adrien, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay, great. So yeah, my name's Adrien Lawyer. I'm the co-director and co-founder of the Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico. We're a 501c3 nonprofit that has been around since 2008, and we serve trans folks throughout New Mexico through a combination of direct services, advocacy, and education. This is Sylvia Rivera. She is a transgender hero, somebody who most of the folks that I train have never heard of before, so I like to lead with her. I think she's somebody well worth looking up. She's one of the many people whose shoulders we stand on today to have a transgender movement at all. All right, so let's do definitions of transgender. For us, this is a really simple term. I think there's a lot of misconception about what this means, but for us, the term transgender is a large umbrella term that's meant to cover any person whose internal gender is different from the sex that they were designated at birth. So when a baby is born, we typically designate it as male or female. For a trans person, what we know deeply to be true about ourselves does not match whatever was said about us on that day. Now you'll notice that our definition does not include the word opposite. We don't believe that there's only two kinds of people. I really don't believe there's only two kinds of people about any topic, really, but I think when you think about gender and physiological sex, the human body, the human identity is much more complicated than that. Intersex people exist. I'm going to show you a really cool video about folks who have some type of a physiological trait that differs from our typical definitions of male and female. And there are certainly trans folks whose gender is something other than simply a man or simply a woman. So we just say when the sex and gender values don't line up 100%, we would call that transgender. It has nothing to do with feeling the opposite, and it has nothing to do with taking medical treatment. Now, for me, I'm a transgender person who does a lot of education on this topic. So it's interesting that as the person who often is teaching about this, my gender is the opposite from my designated sex. I was designated female at birth, but I've known that I was a boy since I was 2 or 3 years old. So as soon as I knew that I was a person, I knew that I was a boy. I'm almost 50 years old now, and I'm still here. I still have the same gender of male. So my gender is male. My designated sex is female. I guess you could call those opposite. I have also obviously had medical treatment. As I love to say, you do not grow an awesome beard like this without taking hormones. If you were designated female at birth like I was. I've been on hormone therapy for about 15 years, and I had surgery on my chest also right around 15 years ago. So for me, those steps were really critical points along my own journey, just to being able to take care of myself better and to love my body and to have an experience living in my body that's positive. I did not have that before. For me, I really needed the medical treatment to be able to be comfortable with myself and to feel at home in my own skin. But I have other trans friends who don't feel that way at all. I know a lot of trans people who feel like they're doing fine without any medical treatment. So we don't want to define being transgender as having medical treatment. I also, of course, know trans folks who would really like to access medical treatment and can't figure out how to get it. So we definitely don't say that you're not really trans if you don't have surgery or take hormones, because there are people who don't have access to those things, and there are people who don't care about having access to those things. Now, transgender man and transgender woman are also important terms for us. These words, when they're misused, I think they are deeply disrespectful to trans folks, and it's really important that we want to acknowledge that when we talk about somebody in this way, if we're going to define somebody as a transgender man or a transgender woman, we want to make sure that what we're really talking about is the person's current and true gender, and that we're not getting bogged down in what type of genitals they were born with. I talk about this a lot, maybe a little bit too much. I spend a lot of time talking about where people get to go to the bathroom and talking about genitals. But I think that we get sort of an old-fashioned idea that your genitals are what make you a man or a woman, when that theory just doesn't hold up very well. There's about 1 in 2,000 women who are not trans, who are born with what's called vaginal agenesis, born without a vaginal opening. There are women who are not trans who can't give birth. There are women who are not transgender who don't have uteruses. So we can't really say that body parts are what define us as men and women, but I think we sometimes get stuck on the idea that that is true, even though really in our society, we don't walk around seeing people's genitals, so we really can't be using that as a criterion to gauge who is what. We still sometimes think that that's how we should think about it. So for us, we want to make sure that you're calling somebody a man or a woman based on what they say about their gender, because that is the only real accurate way of knowing somebody's gender, is to hear it from them and to go with what they tell you. So we say, no matter what somebody looks like to you, the important thing when talking about them or talking to them is to stick with what they tell you about themselves, because that's going to be the best way to gauge whether the person is a man or a woman. Plus, not all trans people want to have the word transgender as a qualifier all the time either. I know a lot of trans folks who would just rather be called men or women without having to be called a transgender man or a transgender woman every time they're spoken about. So I think it's important also to just consider whether or not somebody identifies as transgender and whether that's something you actually need to say about them in the context that you're talking about them. The last important thing on this slide is that the word transgender is an adjective. So we can use the word transgender to modify a noun. We can talk about transgender clients or transgender coworkers, transgender survivors. We don't talk about somebody as a transgender. And the reason for that is just that it's dehumanizing to reduce anybody to a single attribute that they have like that. All people are more complicated than any one single attribute that they have. So of course that's also true about trans folks. So let's talk about how that looks with somebody like me. Some identifiers that I have are that I am a white person, I'm a man, I am transgender, I was born a US citizen, I'm a documented citizen. I think about this a lot because we work with a lot of transgender women who are Central American asylum seekers. The only transgender unit in immigration detention in the country right now is actually in Milan, New Mexico, right near Grants, New Mexico. And so they have a pod in the facility out there that houses only transgender women who are seeking asylum. So I go out every 4 weeks or so to visit with the women in the pod and do a lot of different work with trans women who are undocumented living in this country. So it makes me think a lot about what it means to me to have the identifier of being a born citizen, a documented citizen. I'm also a dad. I have a kiddo who just turned 15 years old, is just starting to drive the car. I'm a musician. I play in a little country band here in Albuquerque. We're called A Band Named Sue. I have a bachelor's degree. I have disabilities. I'm a Southerner, which is kind of a big identifier to me. By this, I mean that I'm from Mississippi, not like Las Cruces. English is my first and only language. I'm pretty embarrassed about that. I've lived in New Mexico for a long time, about 25 years. So it's pretty embarrassing that I've lived here for so long and still the only language that I speak is English. I'm from a mixed class background, meaning like socioeconomic class. And I'm a New Orleans Saints fan. I'm from Jackson, Mississippi. So that's, it's sort of like Albuquerque in that we don't have a professional team in Mississippi. So you find your regional team that you stick with. So I was born a New Orleans Saints fan, and I still am one now. So here's 12 things about me that are on the screen right now. And one of them is certainly being a trans person. I am definitely trans. I travel around the state and actually around the country teaching this material and coming out as a trans person. I run a trans organization that I'm also the founder of. So being trans is a prominent identity to me, but even just on this one screen, there's 11 other things about me that are equally important or equally apt identifiers. So this sort of gives a visual on why we don't want to call somebody a transgender, because anyone who's transgender is also a whole lot of other things. Now, this slide is also an illustration of a principle that we're calling intersectionality. That word was coined in the late 80s, actually. It's not a new term, but it's being used more and more often to describe this idea. And the woman who coined that term, her name is Kimberly Crenshaw. And Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar, and she is also a Black woman. So when she sort of crafted the language around intersectionality, what she wanted to talk about was the fact that when we share an identity attribute, that does not mean that we're going to share the same outcomes in the dominant culture that we live in, because we will also have other identifying attributes that we don't share that will affect the way people perceive us and treat us. So specifically, Kimberly Crenshaw was saying, and I agree with her, she said that our dominant culture in the United States is still a violently sexist culture, a misogynistic culture. But she was saying not all women experience the same discrimination and violence, because the United States is also a violently racist culture. So women of color are going to encounter racial discrimination and gender discrimination, where white women in the United States will almost certainly have some experience of gender discrimination, but not racial discrimination. So we can't just say all women have equal amounts of discrimination because our culture is sexist. And that certainly rings true in the trans communities as well. Because my list is interesting, not for the discrimination that I faced because of it, but actually for the unearned privilege that tends to come my way from this list that's on the screen right now. Before I started to transition, I transitioned about 15 years ago. And before I started my transition, I lived for about 20 years as what my friends and I used to call a butch lesbian. So I was a really masculine looking lesbian woman. I wore all men's clothes. I had really short hair. A lot of times people out in public places couldn't tell if I was a man or a woman, and they would experience discomfort because of that. And then they would, treat me in ways that ranged from being hostile to just being confused. It was a very common thing for me back in those days to be prohibited from using the public restroom. Anytime I would try to use the women's restroom, somebody would try to stop me from going in there, because either they really thought that I was a man trying to go into the bathroom, or they just thought I was too masculine to be allowed to use the women's bathroom in peace. So pretty much anytime I tried to use a public restroom, I had somebody try to tell me that I wasn't allowed to go into that bathroom. Well, now, if you look at the list on the screen, and if you look at the image of me that you're seeing from the camera, you can see that nobody ever questions my right to be in a bathroom, and they haven't in 15 years. So in 15 years since I started transitioning, I have never had one polite person ever check in with me to make sure I was going into the right bathroom. I typically find that people don't question me around anything that I'm doing out in public. People tend to treat what I say with much more authority than they did before. People frequently assume that I'm the leader of any group that I'm in, even if I'm not at all the leader of the group. So I have very different outcomes now than I did before I transitioned, even though I am the same person that I was then, right? That's why we call it unearned privilege. It's because it can't have anything to do with me and the way that I treat other people. When I was, I tried to be polite and kind and gracious and thoughtful before, and still had a lot of people discriminate against me or just, express hostility towards me back in those days, where now they don't, and they tend to, I tend to be taken much more seriously now than I was before. Now, I feel like I have a couple of places on this slide that are vulnerable spots. The couple of places where I could still experience discrimination. And I think they really boil down to being trans and having disabilities. Southerner, I don't know if that's funny to anybody on the Zoom, but Southerner is not something I've experienced discrimination for, like per se, but I have definitely experienced people saying things that were incredibly uneducated and prejudiced about the South when I say that I'm from the South. And interestingly, I had people in the South say similarly uneducated things when I moved here from there. So I think the folks who live in rural states just actually know how that feels, because there's always misconceptions about rural states and just so much stuff that people don't know about it. When I moved to New Mexico from Tennessee, people kept asking me if I had to get vaccinations to move here, which I didn't understand. I couldn't understand what was the thing we were vaccinating against. And then I realized they thought I was moving out of the country, and the way you have to get shots to leave the country. So in that same way, I've had people say similar things about being from Mississippi as well. But I think being trans and being disabled are really clearly marginalized categories. There's no place in our culture right now where you get an unfair advantage from being trans or being disabled. I actually lost a corporate job that I was in 15 years ago when I started my transition. So I've experienced employment discrimination from being transgender, and I could still have that happen today. The sort of ostensible way that it would look for somebody like me is that I would go in for a job interview and I'd be doing really great, and they're telling you, oh, you're a perfect candidate, you're just the one we've been waiting for. Everything's just sort of a formality now. We have to do some paperwork. And then I leave and they run a background check on me. And if you run a background check on me, you are going to see that I legally changed my name, which will out me as a trans person. And that is when we frequently will get a call like, oh, we found someone more qualified for the position, click, right? And it's not that there couldn't be somebody more qualified than me. Of course, there could be tons more qualified people than me. But typically, if they're telling you that you pretty much have the job, and then they run the background check and then you don't get the job, for us, that definitely has a really strong look of trans discrimination. That's when we, very strongly suspect that's probably what happened. Now, the thing about me is that I could experience employment discrimination, but I'm not going to experience random violence from strangers for being trans, because both my transness and my disabilities are things that aren't really visible about me just from being in the same room with me. So when people meet me, they don't know that I'm transgender unless I tell them that I'm transgender. And most folks don't know that I have disabilities unless I tell sort of the whole long story about that too, which is that I got into a really terrible car wreck in 1996. I had about 13 different orthopedic surgeries that resulted from that wreck. Part of my right foot is amputated. I have a rod in my right femur. I'm paralyzed below the knee on the right side. I had bone grafting out of both of my hips. My right leg is shorter than my left. I have chronic pain from the accident, and I also have PTSD from the accident. So those are things that my family is aware of, things that I deal with on a day-to-day basis in terms of being a person who lives with disabilities, but they're not things that people I work with really get to know about me unless we have a whole conversation for them to understand those traits. So for me, even though these are the places I could experience discrimination, for somebody like me, it still isn't going to be the same really bad outcomes that folks with more marginalized identities have. So the people in the trans communities who have the worst outcomes are typically people who hold more marginalized identifiers as a single person. So our drop-in center that we operate in Albuquerque opens up every day at 1 o'clock. We're open from 1 to 6, Monday through Friday. And every day by about 12:30, there's a line outside of the door of people waiting to get in. And they are almost all young. They are almost all transgender women. They are almost all people of color. They are almost all folks who are dealing with some type of medical or behavioral health disability. Many of them don't have a diagnosis for what's going on with them, but it doesn't change the fact that they have a disability that they're dealing with. Most of them are experiencing homelessness. Most are unemployed. Most of them don't have families who love them and care about them. So every day they wait outside the drop-in center to come in and get the only meal they're going to eat that day at our drop-in center. And those folks are all trans, and I'm also trans. So we can't just be talking about being trans. I have a car and a home and a family and groceries every single day, even though I'm also a trans person. And my sisters at the drop-in center lack even the most basic things like a safe bathroom to use and have to go to the drop-in center every day just to be able to use the restroom and get something to eat and check on their mail. So being trans can cause problems for anybody, but the discrimination and violence that trans people face is not at all evenly distributed. Here's a place where I want to just clarify a little bit, because I don't want to be perceived as oversimplifying this. Transgender men do still have problems in our culture. There are still issues that transgender men face. In fact, transgender men actually die by suicide at the highest rate among trans people, but transgender women are vastly more likely to be murdered. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about the intersectional discrimination and violence that people face from society, at the hands of society, and that is very disproportionately geared towards transgender women. I will also say that being visibly trans exposes you to a lot of danger. If people can look at you and see that you're trans, I have many friends who've been attacked on the sidewalk just because they could be picked out as trans folks. So the spoiler on this screen is that everybody up here is trans. I've had a lot of trainees over the years. I've done some version of this training now more than 1,200 times in every single region of the state. And I've had people say things to me like, I think I would always be able to tell if somebody's trans. I think I could always pick out a trans person. And so I like to show these pictures just to kind of be a reminder that you really can't. You really can't. There are certainly some people that are distinctly transgender, and you can see it just by looking at them. But there are lots of us who just blend in all day, every day, and people have no idea that we're there. Everyone on the call today has probably been in a public place with a transgender person and just had no idea that they were even present. But you probably also have all had the experience of seeing somebody out in public and knowing that they were transgender just by looking at them. So let's talk real quickly about why that happens. I think when you can pick out somebody as trans, there's a few different factors that come into play. The age at which you transition is a big deal. Your genetics are a big deal. And the direction in which you're going is a big deal. Because if you are transitioning to male, if you're somebody like me who takes testosterone therapy, testosterone is just the vastly more powerful of the human sex hormones. It is way more potent than estrogen. Estrogen, folks who take estrogen have to also take a testosterone blocker for estrogen to even work on them very well. They have to block the testosterone production in the body. So trans women who take hormones, the hormone replacement regimen for trans women is a medication called spironolactone, which blocks testosterone, and then estrogen on top of it. The hormone regimen for transgender men is just simply testosterone. And all of the stuff that you can see about me and these two guys in these pictures happens just from taking testosterone. So the voice changes, the period stops, the musculature changes, the fat distribution patterns on the body shift, my hairline changed, my body odors changed, the texture of my skin changed, the shape of some of the bones in my face actually changed. I grew a lot of really strange body hair that I wasn't expecting from testosterone. So that all happens. But for transgender women, if these changes have already happened to them from testosterone, if they've been put through their natal puberty, then some of those things can't go back the way that they were ever. So even if you take estrogen, your voice cannot go back from being lowered by testosterone. So if your voice is already lowered from not taking testosterone, but going through a puberty, a testosterone-based puberty, then your voice is just going to be low for your whole life as a trans woman. Some friends of mine actually take classes, vocal coaching classes, that are designed to teach you how to speak in a way that is perceived to be more stereotypically feminine. So I have trans female friends who actually found those classes to be a big confidence booster. But I have other trans women who I know who don't want to have to do that and don't want to have to think about where they're going to pitch their voice every time they want to say something to anybody. So voice is one of those things that can sort of like give people away. Skeletal frame is another. If people are very tall or have really broad shoulders or really large hands, those are things that can cause people to notice them. Hair loss and hair growth are also things that estrogen can't reverse at all. So if transgender women have already experienced a lot of baldness on top of the head, estrogen can never regrow the hair on your head. So some transgender women feel most confident wearing a wig, and for others, they may not feel comfortable wearing a wig. And either way, it can be the fact that they do wear a wig or that they have already experienced baldness that can cause you to be able to see them out in public. And when you can see a trans person out in public, just know that they are experiencing real hostility from people and potentially even very real danger. Okay, so the word cisgender is again a very simple term, and it just means essentially that you are not transgender. So the word cisgender means that your designated sex at birth matches 100% with the gender you know yourself to be on the inside. Now, the reason this term is important is because as trans people, we don't want to hear folks position the opposite of trans as normal. And I still hear that quite a bit. Even here in 2019, I'll hear people say, well, you're either transgender or you're just like a normal person. And to us, that's sort of like, oh, that doesn't feel great. We really believe that it is normal to be trans. That what we're really talking about here is a minority trait. I really, truly believe that we're going to come to find out that trans folks are about 3% of the population. So I really believe this is just a minority trait, a normal human variation that we have not learned how to get along with well yet. And the thing about minority traits is that human beings tend to be wary of minority traits, escalating all the way into hostility and violence towards groups that have minority traits. And we could certainly name groups in our culture right now who are still experiencing violence from having minority traits. But we could also name groups, and that's what I want to do, name some groups who do not experience hostility and violence for having a minority trait anymore, even though they used to. So one of my favorite examples of this is actually red hair. People born with red hair are only about 1.7 or 1.8% of the population. So I actually really truly believe that there are going to turn out to be more trans people than people born with red hair. Now, people with red hair today are not persecuted for it, but they used to be. If you've never heard this before, you might be surprised to hear that human beings used to say that folks with red hair were possessed by the devil. They said that people with red hair did not have a soul, and they were dangerous because they would try to steal your soul because they didn't have a soul. During the witch trials era of history in Europe, people with red hair were accused of being things like vampires and witches. And if you were accused of being a witch, you were most frequently killed just for the accusation. Because what would happen is they would drag you out and test you to find out if you were actually a witch or not. And the test was to drown you. So the thought was that if you were a witch, you were going to use your evil magic powers to save yourself from drowning. So if you died from the drowning, then you were innocent of being a witch. But if you survived the drowning, then you had proven that you really were a witch and they needed to kill you for that. Now, obviously, we don't do this anymore. The statistic that I've read is actually that 30% of women who color their hair choose a shade of red today, which I just don't think that anybody would do if they expected violence to erupt towards them when they came out of the salon with newly red hair. This is something we've learned to get along with and not be so hostile to. The witch trials were a long time ago, though, I know that. So let's talk about another group that was even more recently persecuted, and that is left-handed people. And left-handed people are a really big group of people. They're about 10% of the population. But even 50 years ago, there were still folks who unironically said that left-handed people were possessed by the devil. The word sinister, that means evil, comes from the Latin word for left, which is sinistra. Teachers in schools would sometimes tie these kids' hands behind their backs in the classroom to force them to learn how to write with their right hands, or would smack their hands with rulers until they learned how to write with their right. And again, today we know that that is really a detrimental practice. It's a violent practice. We don't do it anymore. I always tell folks that I'm training, that never in your adult professional lives will you be asked to sit through an hour-long PowerPoint presentation about why you should not be mean to left-handed people, why God does not hate left-handed people, why it is normal to be left-handed, why left-handed people are not possessed by the devil, because you don't need a training for that. You already know that. And I really believe that in 50 or 60 years, there won't be anybody doing this training either. I really believe that we will come to understand that some percentage of people are born trans, just like some percentage of people are born with red hair, and it's really not any bigger deal than that. We're just not quite there yet. So one of the big things that's going to help us to get there, I think, is value neutral language like cisgender. We don't say that someone is left-handed or normal. We say that they're left-handed or right-handed because those are just two things that you can be, neither one of which is better than the other. So we have to learn how to say cisgender as the opposite of transgender to help us move out past this sort of judgmental phase in history that we're still in. Okay, so designated sex at birth just actually means your genitalia. That is how we sort babies into the categories of male and female, is by their external genitals. Your biological sex is actually more complicated than that. It includes your gonads, right? Your internal reproductive organs. It includes your hormones. It includes your chromosomes. I was in the room actually when my kiddo was born, and not one person in that room tested his chromosomes before they wrote boy on his birth certificate. They looked at his genitalia. They said the baby is a boy, and they put it on his birth certificate, which is totally cool. I'm not at all upset. That is how we sort babies. But I think we need to just be real clear that we're only talking about one simple, single criterion when we sort these kiddos into only two categories. And really, there are more than two categories here. Intersex people exist, so let's talk a little bit more about them. And by the way, intersex folks do not want to be called hermaphrodites. So if you've heard the word hermaphrodite before, today is definitely the day to let that word go, because it has become sort of a slur at this point. Intersex people just want to be called intersex. And what it means to be intersex is that you have some type of physiological trait, biological like sex characteristic that is not neatly sortable into our definitions of male and female the way we define them today. So this can include things like being born with ambiguous genitalia, like genitals that are hard to classify as male or female. This can also include things as subtle and invisible as having atypical chromosomes. Some folks are born with what is called Mosaic Genetics, which means that some of their cells have XX chromosomes and some have XY. And you can't actually see it when somebody has Mosaic Genetics. So folks can be intersex and maybe not even know it for their whole lives. The population estimate here currently is right around 1.7%. But I actually think that's low. If there are people who don't even know that they are intersex, then I'm not sure how we get a great count on this group, which is one of the problems for groups like ours. It can be hard to get accurate population numbers, which makes it even more difficult to deal with the marginalization that happens. So I don't think I'm intersex. I don't have any reason to believe that I am. So I'm going to let y'all see this video from some young intersex folks.
I'm Pigeon. I'm Alan. I'm Emily. I'm Cypher. And we are Intersexy. Intersex describes a person who doesn't fit the typical definition of male or female. I have XY chromosomes, but typical female genitalia. I'm a girl who has testes and XY chromosomes. I identify as a queer, gender non-conforming intersex person.
I identify as a Black intersex man.
Intersex is not new. It's been around since the beginning of human existence. I mean, there's probably even intersex dinosaurs, if you think about it.
Transgender has to deal with your gender identity, whereas intersex has to deal with your biological characteristics.
Often, intersex people get surgeries that they don't want, and transgender people have to fight for surgeries that they do want. They gave my mom the excuse that the internal testes were cancerous, that I would develop cancer.
They didn't even come up with an excuse, basically, in terms of a health-related reason. They instead just said it was about the appearance.
A lot of doctors are very uncomfortable with the idea that I have testes, and they're still trying to get them removed, but I'm perfectly healthy and there's nothing wrong with them.
They did a surgery to remove my testes and told my parents to take me home and just raise me as a girl, and I didn't find out about it myself until I was 12.
There aren't a lot of options, or medical providers don't explore other options. My mom would put me in dresses and she would be like, "Oh, aren't you so cute and you're so pretty?" And I would be like, "No, this is horrible." I was put on hormonal treatment, which consisted of estrogen and progesterone. I just wanted to belong. I wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be different. So even though I knew something felt amiss, I conformed. He was very condescending. He was like, "You intersex activists don't know what you're talking about."
It's difficult for intersex people to find each other because from an early age we're told not to talk about our bodies.
I did feel like I was the only one.
My doctors always told me there was nobody else like me, and so it just perpetuates a vicious cycle of shame and stigma that we can't break out of. I would tell another intersex person that you are worthy, you are lovable.
Your body is beautiful. You're beautiful.
Intersex people don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with them.
I know you feel like you might not be able to get through this. I know you might have really dark thoughts, but I want you to know that meeting other intersex people and finding a community or a support group can be one of the most important aspects in your healing process. And we're out there, we're out here, we're here. And I just hope you can find us.
So that for me is always a little bit hard to watch. I hate thinking that we do surgery on those babies and that it is hurting them, and they've been begging us to stop doing it for a really long time. So I just always like to tell people that intersex activists are making really amazing headway on this. They, there are countries around the world that have actually already outlawed these surgeries. There are prominent American and European medical groups, associations that have come out to condemn these surgeries. So I really think that this can change in our lifetimes. I think it's just, it's just a process. I think the most important thing for trans folks is something that also would help intersex people. And that is that culturally, we need to understand that your internal gender is not the same trait as your designated sex at birth. And right now, I think that we don't totally know that. We think if a baby is born and we say, oh, the baby's a girl, then just it is going to be a girl. But that is what they said about me, and I was never a girl. So we've got to come to understand that your designated sex is one real trait that you have. Your internal gender is a different, separate trait that you have. They may even match up, right? For 96, 97% of people, those values match, but that doesn't make them one value. The analogy that I make here a lot is actually around like hair color and eye color. Because we know that most human beings have brown hair and brown eyes all around the planet. But we don't believe that having brown hair makes you have brown eyes, or that there's some correlation that has to take place there. I have brown hair, but I have blue eyes, and nobody has ever suggested having to do any kind of like surgery on my eyeballs to make sure that they're brown and match my hair. We know those are separate things, and we tolerate it pretty well. Right now, we believe that internal gender and designated sex are one thing. So when they don't match, we don't handle it very well. And even the American Academy of Pediatrics has actually released a statement saying that we know our gender between the ages of 3 and 5. And they were specifically talking about transgender kids, although I really believe that that's true for almost everybody. I think most of us know whether we feel like boys or girls by the time that we reach the age of 5. With cisgender kids, when they come and say, hey, I'm a boy or I'm a girl, we just say, yeah, good job. But with a transgender kid, when we come and say, hey, I'm a boy, usually the first thing that we get told is something like, well, you're too young, you don't really know. But either we all know at that age or we all don't know at that age. For me, here I am, 50 years later, still with the same exact gender that I had at 2 or 3 years old. So it's important, I think, that we learn how to acknowledge that these are separate things, and that the realization of a person's internal gender is typically something that happens at a very young age. Internal gender is also the piece we can't really see when we look at each other. What we can see is called gender expression, and that's all the stuff we do around clothing and behaviors and garments, sort of roles. It's cultural, it is historical. Gender norms and gender stereotypes change over time. They don't stay the same. You think about all the jobs in the United States that women do now that even, in the 1950s or 40s were completely off limits. Things like being engineers or professional athletes or surgeons or Supreme Court justices, all the different things that women now do in our culture, but were not able to do before. So gender expression, gender norms are going to shift over time and from cultural group to cultural group, which I think is important to realize because they're not static. They're not set in stone. People put a lot of stock and the gender norms that they grow up with. But since these things are not universal, it helps us to get a little bit of perspective on the fact that they can't really necessarily be right or wrong. They just are very culturally held practices. So being trans doesn't mean that you feel like you are simply a man or simply a woman. Non-binary is a topic that I think a lot of folks still find kind of confusing. And I think the most important thing is just to realize that a person who is non-binary is just very simply saying that they don't conceive of themselves as just a man or just a woman. For each non-binary person, this can be different. There are folks who feel that they are a blend of male and female all the time. There are folks who feel like they are neither male nor female all the time. So if someone says they're non-binary, all we know about them is that they don't think of themselves as just a man or just a woman. Now, again, I'm pretty binary, so I'm going to let these non-binary folks tell you about it because I should not speak for this group probably.
I'm Fox, and this is what non-binary looks like.
I'm Owl, and this is what non-binary looks like. We don't necessarily expect you to know what that means, but let us explain.
I was assigned female at birth.
I was assigned male at birth. While many people understand what it is to be a trans man or a trans woman, being non-binary is still very misunderstood.
Being non-binary means that we identify as neither a man or a woman.
What makes us men or women or non-binary is an inner sense of self.
It's not what genitals we have, what we wear, or who we're attracted to.
It's who we are, which is something no one can take away from us.
Gender identity and gender expression are two different things.
The fact that I present as feminine,
The fact that I present as masculine,
does not make us any less non-binary.
it's just clothes, it's just presentation, it's just a form of expression.
Non-binary people have always existed, and they do so in cultures all around the world.
Non-binary people do not want to erase your identity as a man or a woman.
All non-binary people want is to be respected and acknowledged for who they are.
Non-binary people are real, authentic, and express themselves in so many different ways. We are legally recognized in countries such as Malta, New Zealand, Australia, Nepal, and more.
We encourage all non-binary people to share their selfies under the hashtag #ThisIsWhatNonBinary looks like.
The hashtag is already well and truly underway, and it's a real inspiration for us all.
I'm Al, and this is what non-binary looks like.
I'm Fox, and this is what non-binary looks like.
I love that video because I think the point that they're trying to make is that non-binary really looks like everything. You know, I think when folks hear the term non-binary, a lot of times they imagine that all non-binary people are going to want to look androgynous. But we can see from those selfies that non-binary people express themselves in a million different ways, just like people who are binary express themselves in a whole bunch of different ways. So the last trait that we want to separate out here is sexual orientation, because that is the final sort of separate piece of us as human beings. If you know that somebody is transgender, you still do not know which one of these they are. In the same way that if we know that someone's a woman, we do not know which one of these they are. Your sexual orientation is not governed by your gender, and it is not governed by whether or not you're transgender. So it's just super important, I think, again, to realize that these are very separate. If you don't know what asexual is, let me tell you that it means not having strong sexual attractions to any type of people. Asexual folks feel that that is their innate orientation. They do not feel that they have a medical condition or that they're having a trauma response or anything like that. They just truly believe that this is their orientation, is not to feel a lot of attraction to others. Pansexual is an inclusive term that is really just meant to indicate that the person could be attracted to any type of person. So for pansexual folks, it doesn't matter whether the other person is trans or cis or non-binary or binary or male or female. It just matters that you either click with that person or you don't. And it's just very person-centered that way. It's very individual. All right, so let's look at how this looks on a diagram here. So I don't know if my mouse is showing up on this, but my designated sex at birth was female. So my dot goes right here on this second S, right? I was assigned female at birth. My internal gender, though, is male. So my dot in the green circle goes over on the right-hand side for male, and my gender expression also falls on the male side. So look how my orientation and my gender don't even touch. They're two very separate things. And for us, orientation, attraction, can't be really based on somebody's genitals, because in truth, when we feel an attraction to somebody, we're not going to know what kind of genitals they have. We're going to know how they're presenting themselves out to the world. So for me, my orientation falls on this side of the circle. I was a lesbian for 20 years, and now I'm still attracted to female appearing people. I don't know why that is true about me. I just know that it is true about me. So just for a second, just, quietly, look at these circles and think about where you go right now. Where would your dots go on these circles? All right, let me show you some data, although I'm sorry to have to do it. So the biggest survey of transgender people ever conducted in the United States is called the U.S. Transgender Survey. And 28,000 of us took this survey all across the country and created the single biggest data set on trans folks that currently exists. And it was really bad. There were a lot of really bad outcomes that were reported to the survey, including a completely outrageous rate of suicide attempt. So this is, these are all adults taking the survey, looking back over the course of their lifetimes. And what this question means is, did you actively try to kill yourself, but you survived? And 40% of our family members who took the survey said that they had attempted suicide at least one time in their lifetimes. So if that number is 40% for people who survived, we always think a lot about what does it mean, how many deaths do we think there probably are behind these numbers? Now the data that really gets to me, this national data is super important, but the data that keeps me up at night is actually from New Mexico. And it is from the New Mexico Youth Risk and Resiliency Survey. The YRRS is administered to a large number of public high school students throughout the state. And every state in the country has a YRRS. And every state gets to decide what questions go on their survey. So for the very first time in 2017, we asked our high school students here in New Mexico if they were trans. And 3.4% of our students who were surveyed just said, yes, they do think of themselves that way. That 3.4% were in every single county of New Mexico. And right underneath that, you can see that 2.9% more said, something's going on with me about my gender, but I'm not sure what to call it yet. I don't know if I'm ready to label it being transgender, but there is something going on with me. And we can see that, first of all, they didn't mean I'm unsure about the question, because that was a separate response. And this first time we did this, we unfortunately got a really high rate of response on I don't understand the question. It was about 15% who indicated that they didn't really know what these terms meant. So this year, the YRRS is done every other year. So they're in the process of administering it right now. And you can't change the question because you want the question to be validated against the question year after year or cycle after cycle. So they can't change the question, but what they did this time is actually they wrote a better more thorough introductory paragraph, really explaining what these terms mean in the hopes of getting a lower rate of response around not understanding the question. But the 2.9%, that's not even what they meant. And we can see it because their outcomes over here were as bad or worse than the trans students. So this top line on this slide right here, this graph at the top, is unstable housing. Only 3.9% of our cisgender students reported unstable housing at the time of taking the survey. For the transgender group, for the 3.4% group, the number for unstable housing was actually 35.4%. And for the unsure group, it was 40.1. So the trans and the unsure groups of students had 9 to 10 times more unstable housing than the cis students. And for us, that looks like it's probably correlated, right? We think that these kids are being kicked out of their homes for being this way, and that is why you would see such an incredibly disparate rate of unstable housing between these groups of high school students in New Mexico. And then look at the rest of the bullet points. All of the rest of the disparities were also just equally horrible. Suicide attempt for this group was off the charts. Sexual violence was off the charts. Look at heroin use. I mean, that's just super alarming. It has nothing really to do with heroin either. You know, this is really about like maladaptive coping mechanisms for dealing with the rest of these sort of violent outcomes that are going on for people. So as much as this data is harrowing to me, it also just is a constant sort of daily reminder of why we do what we do. At TGRC, we're trying to create policies that help trans people, to help write new laws that help trans people, to provide the basic services that a lot of times trans folks aren't able to have access to. And for me, that data about our high school students is just a really good everyday reminder that these services are still really needed. I do think that things are changing. I think they're getting better. I think we see more people knowing more about this than ever before. And yet that data from the high schoolers is from 2 years ago. So I think we just still have a really long way to go, you know, in our work, and it definitely keeps us going every day and motivates us that's why we're doing it. Yeah, so when you say young students, so we have a question on the chat that says, what resources are available to young students? And I think it really just depends on where you are in the state right now. For students within the public school districts of Albuquerque Public Schools, Santa Fe Public Schools, and Las Cruces Public Schools, those three largest school districts all have really good trans student policy now. So if a trans student is in LCPS, APS, or SFPS, and they're having issues, they can go to the district for help. Yeah, Sandoval County, I don't know, but we're still kind of having a hard time working with Rio Rancho. They're a little bit more reluctant. But we have a youth group. TGRC has a youth group for teens that meets twice a month. We have a play group for little trans and gender nonconforming children and their families. We have a support group for parents. So we have ways for people to build community with each other and try to share resources. And we're always happy to try to help advocate with schools. If a student is getting mistreated for being trans, TGRC is always thrilled to try to go in and at least talk with the administrator and see if we can help them. Yeah, Navajo Nation's a little bit of a different thing too, especially because it spans outside of the state and has its own, you know, tribal infrastructures. So that's something that I think there is work being done. TGRC is not as proactive with the Navajo Nation because we just don't want to be presumptuous in trying to do that work. What other questions?
I can go ahead and unmute everybody, and if anyone has a question, they can go ahead and ask it.
Yeah. So the question, the chat question that just came out is, do you think some parents are so blown away by this that they hesitate to ask for support and take it out on their kids? I do think that that happens. And I think, you know, I'm a parent myself. I have a 15-year-old kiddo. And I think there's, you know, there's things that are just scary to us as parents if we don't have the education and knowledge around these things. And it's a scary thing to hear that your kiddo belongs to a group of people who have the kind of bad outcomes we can see in the data here, right? Like, I would hate for my child to come to me and tell me that he was part of a group that had this much of an increased suicide attempt rate. So I think for parents, there's a lot of fear that happens here, that their children are going to have a hard time finding love, that they're going to be violently attacked, that they're going to experience employment discrimination. And I think our impulse can sometimes be to try to control the kids in order to protect them, you know? So I think sometimes we see that. And sometimes, yeah, we see people just needing more education and not knowing how to reach out and ask for it. I definitely think that that is true.
Judith Baca, I see that you have your like hand raised. Do you have a question?
Is it done? I think you're on the question.
Yeah, we're just doing Q&A now. I think y'all are unmuted, so if anybody wants to just ask anything, don't be shy.
This is Shannon here at the Nest in Ruidoso Downs, and you'd come here before about 4 years ago when you guys were first starting to get the resource center started. So thank you for doing this today, because there's a lot of information that we didn't have back then.
Yeah.
So for Lincoln County and for Roswell, for Chavez County and Otero County, if there's a person, and we've had transgender people here before, or women who've come and were transgender, where can they get resources for help in southern New Mexico?
Well, depending on what they need, we're still here for them. You know, so like we help people with trans specific items. We help people with name changes, with updating their identity documents. We can do some, you know, limited emergency financial assistance. So, you know, we are the statewide organization right now, even though our headquarters is here in Albuquerque. You know, we try to, if people reach out to us from any part of the state, we try to just plug in and help them if we're able to. So if there's something that we can do, we would say that they should just get in touch with us, and we would love to hear from them, and we'd love to try to help if we can.
Okay. With counseling, do you do counseling over the phone and that kind of thing too?
We do have some case managers. We have social workers on our payroll now who do case management. So I don't know if they've done anything like that, but I don't know why they wouldn't. And we have some good, we have a providers directory on our website as well. I don't know what's listed for those counties. There may not be anything, but I think that there are some of the therapists in Albuquerque who are willing to do Skype and other sort of tele methods, you know.
Okay, thank you.
There's a question from Melinda Pineda. What things could government agencies do to be more inclusive of transgender men and women in their daily work or in providing services?
Yeah, you know, I think we're in a place right now where we need to think about the fact that trans people exist a little bit more. So we find like there is not a major demographic tool. You know, you think about things like the census is coming up this year, and we're part of the efforts to make sure that all of our folks get counted on the census. But even if you want to identify yourself as trans on the census, you can't. It doesn't ask the question. So when we're not counting people that way, when we're not getting a good baseline estimate on the population size, we're going to have a hard time getting the services and representation we need, because it's always easy to just keep underestimating the size of the group. So I always think, you know, I'm in a place right now where I feel like we've got to do good data collection on trans people and make sure that if you're asking for gender on things like intake forms, that you ask the question around gender in a way that helps trans people identify themselves to you. And there's some really good, like, sort of best practices information on how to ask gender as not a single question, but a two-part question to make sure that you're really getting a good count on people that you're serving. Other than that, I'm curious to know, like, what sort of age, like when we talk about medical stuff and public health stuff, it can be a little different than other government agencies. So is there any way to get any more specifics on kind of what part of the government? Did we lose that person?
She just typed it in the question, the Q&A box. Maybe she can. That was Melinda.
Okay. Because I will say, I mean, we're looking at things like we just got a law passed this year. Oh, there you go. Human Services Department and Social Services. Yeah, I would say make sure that you let people identify as trans on intake forms. Like, we really want to be sure that people can get identity documents that really match who they are. We got a law passed this spring that helped to modernize the way that birth certificates are changed here in New Mexico. We're following up with MVD right now to help them also change to get a third marker on driver's licenses instead of there just being two gender markers. We want to see M and F and also X as a non-binary or a third marker. This is happening all around the country right now. We want to make sure that we're not gendering services, you know, if at all possible. So I know, you know, in domestic violence world, y'all actually know this more than a lot of people that we work with, but we don't want to say that every single person who needs domestic violence services is female, because that's not necessarily true, or that every single perpetrator is male, right? The same thing with human services and social services. We just want to make sure that we're not genderizing services or forms, are making gender assumptions about who's coming in for help or what they need. I think training is always a really big thing. We're training Tricor laboratories right now, kind of the biggest like medical labs in the state, who do a lot of blood draws and medical tests for people. And the more they think about this topic, the more they come up with all these ways that they can do a better job for trans consumers, because they know their business better than I do. But when we get this information in front of them, their brains just start to spin around like, oh, we should be doing this, we should be doing that. So I always think, you know, we always just want to train everybody who will let us come train. So social service agencies, human services department, we want to train them if we can. Sex trafficking. Yeah, so the interesting thing about that is sort of how you define it. And right now we're kind of in a place where people are at odds about how to define this. I know there are some groups that basically say all street level sex work is trafficking, because people wouldn't do that type of work if they had access to other types of employment. And I don't know, I mean, I can see where people are coming from with that definition. A lot of the women who access services at our drop-in center in the afternoons are engaged in survival sex work at a street level, and it is incredibly dangerous. I mean, they get hurt all the time. So I think if you think of human trafficking as just any type of street-based sex work, then I would say it deeply impacts the trans community. If you think of human trafficking or sex trafficking as something where you're moving people from place to place to forcibly sort of engage them in profiting off of them as, off of their bodies. I don't know. We don't hear a lot about stuff like that at our center. I'm sure that it happens, but it's not something that we hear of as being sort of an epidemic in that way. But in terms of people being driven to survival sex, trading sex for money, trading sex for a place to stay, having to expose themselves to physical and sexual violence all the time just to try to get a little bit of money or food or drugs. We see that constantly at our center. In fact, we're creating an internship program that's going to be really deep. It's going to be a small cohort of some of the folks that have been accessing services at our center for a really long time, who are just feeling like they're really ready to make a change in their day-to-day lives. And so we're going to provide wraparound services. We're going to provide housing for them for a year. We're going to provide job skill building. We're just going to try to see if we can help people get a foothold in trying to not have to do that kind of work anymore. Oh, good. I'm so glad. I can't believe I can read y'all's questions. I usually have to have my Walgreens cheater glasses to read. I'm almost 50 and everything's falling apart. I think I have arthritis in my knees now, y'all. What is that about? Aging is not for wusses. Oh, sorry, yeah. So the last question we said, it was someone told me before that sex trafficking is a huge issue in the trans community, but I had a hard time finding information on this when I Googled it. So it was basically, do I know anything about human trafficking issues? And we answered that. What type of government services are you looking at? And they were asking, how do you make sure that folks engaging in providing government services do a good job of thinking about trans people? The question before that was, do you think some parents are so blown away by this that they hesitate to ask for support and take it out on their kids? And before that, the first question was, what resources are available to young students? And then they specifically asked about Sandoval County schools and about the Navajo Nation.
Do you have any more questions?
So what's on the screen right now is my cell phone number and my email address. So please don't hesitate, to get in touch with us. If you have somebody that needs our help, give them that information. If you want us to come and do a training in your area, in your region, for your organization, for your staff,